1st of September, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai stopped with his hand resting on the intelligence report. His single good eye, the other lost to American gunfire the previous year, moved across the page. Then he laughed, loud enough to turn heads inside the humid operations tent. The Americans have built a new fighter. Heavy like a bomber. Why like a transport? They call it the Hellcat. According to the report, it weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero. To Sakai, that meant only one thing. Another American design mistake. Through the open tent flaps, he could see his squadron's Mitsubishi A6M Zeros parked on pierced steel planking. Lean, agile, and lethal. For 2 years those aircraft had ruled the Pacific skies. British Hurricanes, American P-40 Warhawks, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes. All of them had fallen to Zero guns. This new American machine, thick and overweight, would be no different. What Sakai did not know, what none of the Japanese naval aviators preparing for the morning briefing understood, was that in exactly 30 days this supposed failure would begin the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The Grumman F6F Hellcat would eventually achieve a kill ratio of 19-1. It would shoot down 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 in air-to-air combat. It would change carrier warfare, cripple Japanese air power, and expose the fatal assumptions that had supported the Zero's dominance. The balance of air combat was about to shift, not because of elegance or maneuverability, but because of an aircraft that looked awkward, flew heavy, and ignored everything Japanese designers believed was essential. Within half a year, many of the same pilots now laughing at intelligence summaries would be writing final letters home, fully aware that meeting Hellcats in the sky meant the odds were against survival. In September 1943, confidence inside the Japanese Navy was not simple arrogance. It was built on numbers. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had posted victory ratios that seemed unreal. At Pearl Harbor, they lost 29 aircraft while destroying 347. In the Philippines, they lost 7 while downing 103. Over Darwin, 2 losses for 30 victories. The British Far East Fleet's air arm had been wiped out. The Dutch East Indies Air Force had collapsed in days. At the center of this success was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, an aircraft that had changed fighter design. When captured examples were tested by American engineers in 1942, the performance figures seemed unbelievable at first. A fighter with the range of a bomber, the turning ability of a biplane, and enough firepower to destroy almost anything it caught seemed impossible. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, later known as Japan's top ace with 87 confirmed victories, described the Zero in his recovered diary. Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The airplane answers thought, not just movement of the controls. American aircraft fly like trucks. Strong, but awkward. They build fighters the way they build automobiles. Heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. The Zero achieved its extraordinary performance through a radical design philosophy. Extra super duralumin, a secret aluminum alloy, produced a structure roughly 30% lighter than comparable American aircraft. There was no armor plate protecting the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks adding weight. Even the radio was often removed to save 30 pounds. Every ounce sacrificed in favor of speed and agility. Early reports about the F6F Hellcat reached Japanese intelligence through neutral Swedish channels in early 1943. The specifications sounded exaggerated, maybe even planted as misinformation. The aircraft weighed 12,186 pounds when loaded. A Zero weighed about 5,800. Its wings covered 334 square feet and were driven by a large radial engine that created drag. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, armor plating throughout, bullet-resistant glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks holding 250 gallons. Captain Minoru Genda, the strategist behind the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the data at Combined Fleet Headquarters. His written assessment, later preserved in Japanese defense archives, dismissed the threat. The Americans have learned nothing. This Hellcat continues their failed approach, trying to replace pilot skill with sheer weight of machinery. A Zero will fly circles around it. The math seemed to support that conclusion. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot gave it a turning radius of about 612 feet. The Hellcat's wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested a turning radius greater than 900 feet. In a turning fight, the foundation of Japanese air tactics, the Hellcat appeared doomed. The first real sighting came on September 30th, 1943, near Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission when he noticed 6 dark blue aircraft climbing from the southeast. His initial thought, written later in his after-action report, was that they were B-25 bombers on an unusual course. Then the shapes turned. He saw the outlines clearly. Single engines. Massive bodies. Wings that looked too small for the fuselage. First encounter with F6F type fighter, he would write. His first reaction was disbelief. Americans had bolted fighter guns onto something that looked like a torpedo bomber. He attacked using the textbook method. Standard doctrine meant using the Zero's tighter turning circle to get behind the enemy. Fukui rolled into a diving turn, sure the bulky American machine would continue straight. That would let him curve neatly onto its 6 o'clock. Instead, he saw something he had never witnessed before. The Hellcat did not run. It did not try to turn with him. It went straight up. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine delivered 2,000 horsepower, nearly 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai, which produced about 1,130. The American fighter climbed at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow. He watched his airspeed bleed away as the Zero strained against gravity. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat did something that seemed impossible for such a heavy aircraft. It kicked into a hammerhead turn and dropped directly behind him. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui wrote later. 6 machine guns, not 4 like we expected. The volume of fire was beyond anything we had seen. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. He escaped only by throwing the Zero into a spin. Fukui survived, barely reaching Marcus Island with his aircraft torn full of holes. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao Sato, never returned. The reconnaissance aircraft they had been escorting was also lost. First blood had gone to the Hellcat. On October 5, 1943, Task Force 14 struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what they assumed would be another minor raid. American carriers had been staging quick hit-and-run strikes for months, usually retreating before Japanese fighters could engage in strength. Shiga believed this time would be different. We climbed to 20,000 feet, he wrote in his diary. Below us were 12 F6F fighters in 3 divisions. We had altitude, position, and surprise. Victory seemed certain. What happened next tore apart Japanese tactical assumptions. As the Zeros dove, the Hellcats did not scatter or attempt tight turns. They stayed in formation, picking up speed in a shallow dive that preserved their energy. When the Zeros opened fire at long range, hoping for lucky strikes, the Hellcats simply endured it. Each Hellcat carried 212 pounds of armor protecting the pilot, another 110 pounds shielding the oil system, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb dozens of hits. As the Zeros burned through ammunition in repeated diving passes, the Americans counterattacked. Instead of turning into dogfights, the Hellcats used their weight and power. Climbing at full throttle, they reached altitudes where Zero engines gasped for air. At 25,000 feet, a Hellcat could still produce about 1,650 horsepower. A Zero was down to around 900. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote. Their weight gave them diving speed we could not match. They would slash down, fire those 6 terrible guns, and climb away before we could react. 8 Zeros were destroyed. Not a single Hellcat was lost. By November 11, 1943, at Rabaul, the mood had changed. Pilots of the 204th Air Group gathered as Lieutenant Commander Takao Tanamizu briefed them on American tactics. Tanamizu, credited with 32 victories, was one of the few who had survived several encounters with Hellcats. Forget everything you think you know about air combat, he told them. The Americans have rewritten the rules. They refuse to fight our kind of battle. They fight like executioners, not warriors. Tanamizu explained the lesson Japanese pilots were learning too slowly. The Hellcat was not built to outturn a Zero. It was built so it never had to. Using what Americans called energy fighting, Hellcat pilots kept their speed and altitude. They turned height into speed during fast slashing attacks that left Zero pilots no chance to use their superior maneuverability. They work in pairs, Tanamizu said. One high, one low. While you are busy with one, the other is already diving on you. Their radios, which we mocked for adding weight, allow perfect coordination. We fly as individual samurai. They fight like parts of a machine. By December 1943 at Truck Lagoon, the technology gap was impossible to ignore. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, now served as air operations officer for the combined fleet. Inspecting damaged Zeros returning from combat with Hellcats, he saw the difference clearly. The imbalance in firepower could be measured. A Hellcat's 6 Browning M2 machine guns each fired 750 rounds per minute, for a combined total of 4,500 rounds per minute. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams, and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, delivering about 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero's two 7.7mm machine guns fired 11-gram bullets at 2,300 feet per second, producing roughly 750 foot-pounds of energy. Even more troubling were reports of American radar-directed interceptions. Japanese pilots still depended on their own eyesight to find enemies. Hellcat pilots were being guided by shipboard radar controllers who could detect Japanese aircraft from 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi described his first experience with radar-controlled interception. We were climbing through clouds when they struck us. There had been no warning at all, no visual contact before the attack. Hellcats dropped out of the sky from above, aligned perfectly with our course and altitude. They knew exactly where we were and how we were flying. We were blind men fighting opponents who could see in the dark. By January 1944, the crisis in Japanese pilot training had become severe. Before the war, the Imperial Navy's program had been the most demanding in the world. Training lasted 3 years, and naval pilots entered combat with about 700 flight hours. Army pilots received no less than 500 hours. They were masters of aerobatics, gunnery, and the mental discipline considered essential to aerial combat. By early 1944, reality was different. New naval pilots were reaching the front with only 300 hours. Army pilots sometimes had just 200. Fuel shortages forced most training into gliders. Live gunnery practice was cut to 50 rounds per pilot. Formation flying, instrument flying, and radio procedure training were dropped entirely in the rush to fill cockpits. At the same time, American pilots arrived in combat units with at least 300 hours, including 50 in the exact aircraft they would fight in. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, drilled carrier landings until they were instinctive, and practiced energy tactics safely over training fields in Texas. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, wrote in his final report, "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto joined a frontline unit. He had never fired his guns in flight. "We have no ammunition for training." He had never flown at night. "We have no fuel for that either." He survived 7 minutes in his first battle. From October 12th to 16th, 1944, the Battle of Formosa exposed the truth even more brutally. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commanding the Second Air Fleet, committed nearly everything he had to stop American carrier strikes around Formosa. More than 700 aircraft went into action, including the last well-trained pilots from home defense units. Japanese headquarters initially claimed a massive victory. Reports spoke of 26 carriers and battleships sunk and 300 American aircraft destroyed. When the surviving pilots returned and gun camera film was reviewed, the reality was devastating. Actual American losses totaled 89 aircraft. Japanese losses reached 329 planes and almost all of their remaining experienced airmen. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few veterans who survived, later described it in his memoirs. Hellcats were positioned at every altitude. If we climbed, they were above us. If we dove, they were already below. They divided the sky into sectors, each one covered by a division of fighters. It was not a battle. It was systematic extermination. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the imbalance became undeniable. The Japanese Navy committed its rebuilt carrier force to Operation Ago, hoping for a decisive victory that would break American carrier power. 9 carriers launched 450 aircraft, crewed by the best remaining pilots. Opposing them was Task Force 58 with 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, about 450 of them F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his strikes in 4 waves, convinced that Japanese skill and the Zero's long range would win the day. The first wave of 69 aircraft lifted off at 8:30 in the morning. American radar picked them up at 150 miles. Hellcats were directed to intercept with perfect positioning. They had altitude advantage, the sun behind them, and approached from the Japanese blind side. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the escort fighters, spotted the Hellcats shortly before contact. They were layered from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, at least 60 of them, waiting like a steel curtain. We were at 18,000. Every advantage belonged to them. The fight lasted only 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were destroyed. Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander of Air Group 15, shot down 7 aircraft that day alone. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, claimed 6. The Zeros tried to turn with us, McCampbell reported later. We refused. We would make a high side pass, shoot one down, then zoom back up to altitude. They tried to follow, stalled out, and another Hellcat finished them. By the end of the day, Japanese forces had lost 346 carrier aircraft and another 50 land-based planes. American losses totaled 30 aircraft from all causes. That evening, American pilots in their ready rooms coined a name for the battle. They called it the turkey shoot. To them, the enemy aircraft had been as defenseless as game birds. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Commander David McCampbell set his single-mission record. Leading 7 Hellcats from the carrier Essex, he intercepted about 60 Japanese aircraft heading toward the American fleet. During a 90-minute engagement, McCampbell shot down 9 planes, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers. His wingman, Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill, McCampbell wrote later. The Hellcat performed flawlessly. My aircraft was not hit once, even though we were outnumbered 8-1. That fight showed how completely air superiority had flipped. 7 Hellcats scattered 60 Japanese aircraft, shooting down 15 without losing a single plane. McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day feats, 7 kills on June 19 and 9 on October 24, brought him the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. After the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf battles, a psychological breakdown spread among surviving Japanese pilots. Later, military psychologists would call it Hellcat psychosis. Admiral Ozawa wrote in his after-action report, "The enemy's radar-directed fighter control achieved what we thought impossible, the industrialization of air combat." Each Hellcat was no longer just a fighter, but a piece of a larger system. Our pilots, regardless of individual skill, were fighting not aircraft, but an integrated machine. Pilot shortages became desperate. By early 1945, naval pilot training had been cut to 40 to 50 hours. Army pilots received 60 to 70. Kamikaze pilots were given only 40 to 50 hours in total, roughly a week of instruction. From April through June 1945, during Operation Iceberg off Okinawa, Japan launched about 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet. The Hellcat's role shifted. It was no longer only a fighter. It became a shield against suicide attacks. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, commanding his Flying Circus Division of Hellcats, downed 23 Japanese aircraft during the campaign. His tactical changes, using 4-plane divisions in tight coordination, made traditional Japanese attack patterns almost suicidal. "We developed what we called the mowing machine," Valencia said. 4 Hellcats flying line abreast, spaced about 100 yards apart, would sweep through Japanese formations at high speed. Each pilot covered his assigned sector. We made one pass, climbed back to altitude, and did it again. The numbers from Okinawa were clear. Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties, claimed 2,351 victories, and lost 249 aircraft, roughly a 9.5-to-1 ratio. Even more important, they stopped about 80% of kamikaze planes before they reached their targets. By 1945, the technology gap was impossible to close. The F6F Hellcat included upgrades that made it even more effective. Water injection boosted engine output to 2,200 horsepower. Zero-length rocket launchers were added. Armor protection improved. The K-14 computing gunsight automatically calculated deflection for the pilot. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's famous ace, credited officially with 28 victories, though modern estimates suggest closer to 15, first fought Hellcats in June 1944. Despite all his experience, he nearly died in that first encounter. "I flew my best aerobatics," he wrote later. "Loops, rolls, split S-turns, every maneuver I had mastered in more than 200 combats. The Hellcat followed without difficulty, almost casually. I lived only because the American pilot made a mistake. He forgot to drop his external fuel tank before entering combat." By the end of the war, the numbers told the story. The F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in air combat. It lost 270 planes to enemy fighters. Its kill ratio stood at about 19.3 to 1. 305 United States Navy aces flew Hellcats. The type accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories. For Japan, the human cost was devastating. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who began the war, fewer than 100 experienced combat pilots were still alive by August 1945. The shift from elite aviation force to kamikaze tactics was the final admission of the Hellcat's dominance. Unable to compete in conventional air combat, Japan turned its pilots into guided weapons. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who organized the kamikaze program, explained the logic bluntly. If a Zero attacks a carrier in the normal way, the chance of success is almost zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. If the Zero becomes a bomb, the chance of hitting rises to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death achieves something. On October 25, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa escorted the first official kamikaze mission, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. That day he claimed his 86th and 87th victories, 2 Hellcats. The next day, October 26, 1944, Nishizawa was killed as a passenger on a transport aircraft shot down by Hellcats from fighting Squadron 14. Japan's leading ace, helpless without a fighter of his own, died at the hands of the very aircraft he had briefly defeated. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Jinda, who had once dismissed the Hellcat as clumsy weight without finesse, listened to the broadcast. Around him were the remnants of Japanese naval aviation. Teenage pilots with barely 40 hours of flight time, aircraft assembled from spare parts, and empty fuel tanks. That same day, after 2 in the afternoon, Ensign Clarence Moore of Fighting Squadron 31, flying from the carrier below Wood, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender, was heading toward the American fleet when Moore intercepted him. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns brought down the aircraft, ending the air war in the Pacific. September 1945 at Atsugi Airfield. The first American aircraft to land after Japan's surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from the carrier Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crews gathered along the runway, staring at the machine that had dominated them. Lieutenant Robert Vrashu, an American ace credited with 19 victories, put on a demonstration for the Japanese aviators. He flew loops, rolls, and steep climbs that would have torn a Zero apart. The spectators watched in silence. Through an interpreter, Vrashu explained, "You have to understand, this is not even near the limit. In combat, with water injection, the engine delivers about 20% more power. The airframe is stressed to handle 13 Gs. I have never managed to break one." After the war, Japanese engineers were allowed to examine captured Hellcats. They discovered just how wide the gap in industrial capability had become. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine contained 2,804 precision machine parts, each built so that any piece could be swapped with the same part from another engine. The Nakajima Sakai engine used in the Zero required hand fitting. No 2 engines were truly identical. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat in detail after the war. His conclusion was blunt. "We built an aircraft for 1941. They built an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were mastering the industrial age." Grumman's production of the Hellcat became a weapon in itself. The factory at Bethpage, New York, ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak output, one new Hellcat rolled off the line every hour. In just 30 months, Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats, a figure that Japanese planners could hardly comprehend. In 1944 alone, Japan produced about 5,100 fighters of all types. The United States built roughly 35,000 fighters that same year. The American system relied on methods that seemed unreal to Japanese observers. Workers using color-coded instructions to assemble complicated components, shifts running around the clock, and quality maintained despite enormous speed. The Hellcat did more than win engagements. It changed naval warfare itself. Before the war, carriers were seen as fragile weapons that had to strike first or be destroyed. The Hellcat reversed that idea. With Hellcats overhead, carriers became floating fortresses able to absorb and repel air attacks. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, recognized this shift. With the Hellcat, we do not need to find them first, he said. Let them come. The F6F will deal with them when we choose. This confidence allowed operations that would have seemed reckless earlier in the war. American carrier groups could remain off enemy coastlines for weeks, protected by layers of Hellcat fighters that made them nearly immune to air assault. Beyond technology, the Hellcat embodied a philosophy that clashed directly with Japanese military culture. The samurai tradition valued individual skill, spiritual strength, and acceptance of death. The Hellcat represented system efficiency, material superiority, and the protection of the pilot's life. Because of this difference in outlook, Japanese aviators struggled to adapt to Hellcat tactics even after they understood them. Refusing combat when at a disadvantage, a core part of American fighter doctrine, was almost unimaginable to men raised under Bushido ideals. In 1962, the United States Navy held a symposium on Pacific War aviation. Veterans from both sides met to discuss the conflict. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, put it simply. The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable. Commander Saburo Sakai answered with equal honesty. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We did not understand that difference until it was too late. We broadswords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The Hellcat's dominance can be summarized in numbers that tell a deeper story. Its overall kill ratio was about 19-1, and roughly 13-1 against Zeros specifically. 12,275 Hellcats were produced in 30 months. Between 1943 and 1945, Japan built roughly 6,000 Zeros. More than 5,000 American pilots trained to fly Hellcats. By August 1945, fewer than 100 Japanese combat pilots with real experience remained. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the Japanese fleet at the Philippine Sea, later gave a clear assessment. We laughed at the Hellcat because we did not realize it represented not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's way of fighting. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces no longer existed. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until the year 2000. In his final interview, he was asked about the Hellcat. His answer summed up its impact. The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan understand it had never been as strong as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were simply men with outdated weapons facing the future. Every Japanese pilot who survived did so because a Hellcat pilot chose not to press the attack. That is the deepest form of defeat, living at the mercy of your enemy. The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing nearly twice as much as a Zero. It carried armor the Zero lacked. Its engine produced power Japan could not match. Its guns delivered firepower the Zero could not equal. It was guided by radar systems Japanese pilots could not detect. It was flown by pilots whose training standards Japan could not sustain. It was built in numbers Japan could not hope to approach. Japanese pilots had laughed at it because they did not understand that every extra pound represented protection made possible by an industrial democracy that could afford to safeguard its airmen. By the time they realized that truth, laughter had turned into final letters home, mockery into suicide missions, confidence into collapse. The Hellcat did more than defeat the Zero. It ended an entire way of thinking about air war, proving that in modern conflict, The nation able to build the stronger system will overcome the one that relies only on individual skill. Japanese pilots had laughed at the F6F Hellcat. In the end, it was the Hellcat that had the last laugh.